Good morning. Well, everyone's been talking about the lights, and it is difficult to see you. My name is Carsten Knoch. I am here from Canada, and I'm here to present a piece of research that was commissioned by Think TV Canada, as Justin's mentioned. We did the research last year, and the primary purpose was this. We were wondering, the industry invests in quantitative study after quantitative study that proves pretty conclusively, time and again, that television works great, that television in many cases works significantly better than digital advertising alternatives. And yet we're seeing television advertising revenues in a way being moved to the digital world. And so we were wondering whether we could produce some insights, some new insights on this question as to why. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is approximately broken down as follows. I'll talk to you a little bit about our research methodology. I will talk about my findings along three main themes, and obviously I'll explain in detail what those are all about. And then I'll give you some conclusions at the end, tailored to various types of audiences or audience members that might be here today: broadcasters, media agencies, and brands. I'll just briefly say a few words about Think TV Canada. So Think TV is a marketing and research association dedicated to the advancement of commercial television in Canada. You have something called ThinkBox here in the UK that's very similar, and there's a Think TV in Australia, so it's a common thing, basically. Think TV conducts, funds and distributes research to Canadian brands and media agencies and the broadcast industry. It also runs in Canada the clearance agency for commercials, which are vetted against legal and community standards in order to get them on air. And Think TV is supported by its member companies, who together represent over 95% of television advertising revenue in Canada. So it's an industry-funded initiative. Okay, so introduction and purpose of my study. So the overview is as follows. I conducted in-depth qualitative interviews with 10 Canadian marketers. I know this sounds like a low number. I have a background in anthropology, so unlike sociologists, we tend to focus in on smaller numbers of people, and we talk to them at length and in depth, and then we do a whole bunch of cultural analysis type stuff to understand what they're telling us. We spoke to people from large known brands with major television budgets. So I would say for this context that these were the Canadian subsidiaries of large brand companies that we would have worldwide. So I would have to assume that, these views and perspectives would not be entirely dissimilar to what you might find in other markets. We got participants from FMCG, automotive, retail, travel, and technology. The titles were senior or group brand manager, marketing manager, or director level marketers, and we also had a vice president of marketing. One of the eyebrows raised by this was that people have said, oh, it sounds a bit junior. The reality is the people we spoke to all had, I would say, on average about 15 years and many more than 15 years of experience. We did in-depth telephone interviews. The purpose was to understand the sorts of on-the-ground realities of marketers and priorities that they have. So for example, in regards to media strategy and execution, measurement and ROI, their views on digital versus television, priorities, interests, decision drivers, preoccupations. Now, what I've done for the purposes of this presentation, and I've delivered the same presentation a few months ago at the Future of TV Forum in Toronto, is I've taken a particular cut through the material, and maybe in the question and answer afterwards we can touch on other things. I know, so realistically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology. What we did is in-depth phone interviews, recorded, transcribed. So we had, 600 plus minutes of audio. We had hundreds and hundreds of transcribed pages. There's a lot of information in the corpus of knowledge that I'm not going to be talking about here today. that gets to marketers' views on all sorts of things. So you could test me later and see if I know other stuff too that you're interested in. We used a recruiting firm for research participants. We offered participants a kind of financial incentive, so a honorarium or a charitable donation. Not surprisingly, the more senior folks chose the charitable donation and the more junior folks took the honorarium. We did a bunch of detailed analysis, and then also, you know, the research has now, in a way, taken on a bit of a life of its own, in the sense that, you know, very early this year, we presented it to the Think TV board, so its members got to see it first, and subsequently directly to a lot of those Canadian broadcasters who each, I think, took their own learnings from it, and I think are also maybe starting to look at how to rethink certain approaches as a result. And then, as I said, it was done at the Toronto Future of TV event, and now here. I have had some interesting responses that I didn't quite see coming, and I don't know why I didn't see it coming, but from marketers who were, you know, brand people who were at the Toronto event. One CMO contacted me via LinkedIn afterwards and said, you know, your presentation was kind of shocking but rang true. And I said, why? And he said, well, he said it sounded like you were describing the bad behaviors I see in my team every day. So let's start with theme 1. This is how marketers would like to be seen and how they think of themselves. All of these threads, these 3 themes in a way, I hope come together as we go through the presentation. So, you know, every so often as I go through the slides, think back to the earlier slides and see what meaning they hold for you. How marketers want to be seen. So, you know, the bubbles in my presentation are direct quotes from one of the participants. I think of myself as a creative person first and foremost. This is a curious and slightly surprising thing, perhaps, particularly for those of us who have been in their work with this or in this industry focused on the media side, sometimes the numbers or math side, and so on. Marketers, even though, you know, these are not, in our definition, perhaps creative people as such, like to think of themselves as creative. I think what they mean by creative is a raft of other things too, like innovative, forward-looking, connected to others, sort of plugged in, knowledgeable and insightful. It's important to sort of keep these things in mind and in perspective. I think in a way, of course, we all want to feel like this, but it's important to keep in mind that, you know, marketers kind of came out of the gate saying, this is who I am, this is who I would like to be. Media is, of course, only a part of their portfolio of activities, right? It's a comparatively small percentage of everything they do, even if it constitutes a very large portion of their budget. So generally, they were very excited about creative execution for all media types. I had people, effectively non-specialists, tell me about, you know, how the production costs are going down, how you can now do 4K for digital, there's a lot of excitement about you know, still about going on a shoot and all of those kinds of things. I suppose these are really exciting things. They are somewhat excited about digital media planning and execution. And they are not at all excited about broadcast media planning and execution. Well, we'll dig into why. So, their knowledge about broadcast media is quite limited. So what marketers know about broadcast media planning is, it's metaphoric, I would say, at best. They think of broadcast media planning as planning, buying, and execution as a sort of string of activities as a technical function, because they've traditionally always been told that it is a technical function. The industry, in many ways, I think for decades, has kind of signaled that, you know, the work becomes progressively more technical as you move through the chain of execution, where you might have you know, you might still be able to talk about the plan, but when it comes to buying and so on, that's really something that's done by the specialists. And of course, this technical function has traditionally always been assigned to the media agency. What they do know is they have a somewhat metaphorical understanding of GRPs, so the metric in their minds in terms of size to buy is a GRP. When I tried to dig down and have them explain to me what a GRP actually is, that didn't go so well. The truth is, what I actually discovered is that some of them had a number in mind, which was sort of curious, and it's a number that they carried with them from job to job, even when they switched categories. So, you know, I had somebody who came from, I don't know, children's toys and was now in cosmetics or something like that, and they had carried with them the idea that they need a minimum of X, and that idea, that was still sort of like the yardstick in their mind, and that's what they talked to their agency about and things like that. But it wasn't really based in a kind of depth analysis of the category or anything like that. It was just it was a number, basically. Somebody else here said, when it comes to television, to be very blunt, we trust our media agency to put together the right media plan that meets our reach targets or GRP targets. That's it. It's kind of like hands off. It, you know, it goes into the delivery, and there it is, and we don't think about it again. Their knowledge about digital media, this is really interesting. They do have a very active interest in this. And think back to last year, so some of the topical things may have rung true then and may now no longer ring quite as true, right? It's about a year ago that I did the field work for this. There was a lot of talk that they offered. I didn't ask them about this. They offered a lot of talk about A/B testing. They're really excited about A/B testing. And of course, they see it as something that you can't do on television. They actually feel that A/B testing and other aspects, other properties of digital platforms speak to their creative or innovative side. And again, of course, to how they would like to be seen. So in digital, you can do A/B testing at a highly affordable price. You know, and then in digital you can get very specific in terms of measurement. You're not only looking at impressions, you can go as deep as engagement. So a lot of these sorts of ideas that I think have been around for a very long time, some possibly, you know, discredited now, but they were offered to me as exciting things. A strong concern of all marketers really was whether the copy, in other words, the creative, was effective for the intended audience, and this is something that A/B testing on the digital side they felt was helping them address, and something that they said was just very expensive to do on television and therefore sort of impossible. Strategy versus execution. This I found also kind of interesting. The idea of, you know, how did they think of themselves on the spectrum between, you know, being strategically focused or being execution focused? Well, they didn't really talk about their strategic objectives. And I don't think that was just because, you know, a market researcher was calling them. I think my impression was that their focus really was execution for the most part. So, you know, it was about annual budgets, it was about delivering well within sort of annual objectives, corporate context, competing well within Canada, and then executing well was about orchestrating and coordinating all the marketing functions and agencies. I basically started them off by saying, you know, what's your name, what's your organization, tell me what your role is, and then describe to me what you do, and out of this you get this kind of, here are all these things that I have to coordinate and do and orchestrate and make happen. It almost felt like it didn't leave very much time to do any kind of strategic thinking or strategic orientation. There was never any mention of long-term brand strategy, which could have been a sample size problem, but I'm not sure it was. Branding, they think of as a category of advertising implementation, and one that has in their minds a high barrier to entry because branding in their minds still is very closely associated with television campaigns. An alternative view about branding is that it is a kind of byproduct of ordinary advertising activities. So I found this kind of interesting as well. I asked questions about you know, do you know your CMO? Do you, or your, you know, global organization CMO? And the answer I got from the Canadians, admittedly, was, well, if by know you mean, do I see him or her speak on a stage once a year at the global conference where we all come together, then yes. But if by know you mean, have I had a conversation with them and do I understand what the global strategy should be? No. So, okay. Moving on to the second theme. So the first idea was really to say they think of themselves as creative people, innovative. There are certain things they would like to be seen as. And so keep that in mind as we go forward. So the next theme is what I'm calling the agency roundtable or the sphere of influence. So the agency roundtable is, here's how this came up in all of my conversations. I said to them after we'd done the introductions and they'd sort of told me about their jobs, and I said, describe to me your team context. And they said, well, which team? Which team do you mean? I said, I don't know, you tell me. And they said, well, there's the other marketers across the corridor and the two people who work for me. Or, do you mean the agency roundtable where we get together once a week with, you know, either all of the agencies or a subset of the agencies, and we kind of discuss the real work? And so what emerges is this idea that there is a close-knit collegial structure in the marketer's context, which emerges as a kind of the primary place to be seen. It is not necessarily that the marketer and his or her two employees and the peers across the hall are the team. They're also a team of sorts, but really it's the agency roundtable where all the influencing, but also all the seeing takes place. So, you know, they have regular meetings with all the agency client representatives where work is discussed and coordinated and information is shared. And it emerges as more significant than the other employees in the same company. So it is really the primary place where I can, if I'm a marketer, I can be seen as creative, innovative, forward-looking, and all of those things. The sphere of influence then is this kind of, happens in this important social context. It's a high trust environment. It's an environment where critical questioning is minimized or suppressed. I found this really interesting. I would, you know, as a sort of semi-industry outsider, I can ask semi-naive questions like, do you ever question your media agency about spend recommendations? And what I would sort of get back is that, well, we do because we're supposed to, but really we so appreciate the long-term stability of this work context, that this roundtable context, that it's not kind of our primary thing that we do. It's not how we want to be. It could also be that they're just being polite Canadians, but I don't know. It is, in other words, where stability and long-term relationships are highly valued. Information in this environment is also more highly trusted. We'll get a little bit later in the presentation to sources of where they get information from. And you know, there's a lot of emphasis or a lot of influence carried by things that are forwarded by the agency advisors. And of course, hidden agendas as a result are also less likely to be recognized in a context that is, you know, that implies long-term trust. How marketers get their information. So the primary, and I've sort of ranked them by occurrence and also by how they talked about it. Very frequently, the first thing that came to their mind was, well, it's when my agency forwards something to me. So that's interesting, right? So it gets the stamp of approval when it's put in front of somebody. Websites, these may or may not be known, or I mean, I'm sure Ad Age is known, but you know, Strategy, I believe, is a Canadian publication. Newsletters from marketing sites, conferences, blogs and LinkedIn, and in approximately this order. Let me see. So the other thing I want to introduce at this point is this kind of fantastic moment with each one of my participants. I asked them at one point a very strategically phrased question. I said, do media salespeople ever call you? And the answer was the standard classic answer that you're all expecting, which is no. If they do, like, I asked, do you ever speak to media salespeople? And they said, no, no, I'll send them straight to my agency, which is what you're supposed to do. And then I said, okay, not even Facebook or Google. And there was this pause. I literally have 10 pauses on tape. And then they start to laugh. And then they go, oh no, those guys are in here every other week. So it was an interesting moment, and it was kind of an important moment in the research work, right? Because it signals that something kind of curious has happened here. There's a different class of vendor now who has access under a different set of rules. And the work that was done in some ways was to, following this, was to sort of dig in and to get a better sense of what's happening here. And more about that later. Now, my final theme that I want to talk about is, that every product has two sides. And I also want to talk about the attention economy. And again, I promise this all comes together in some way. Advertising media itself is a product. I know that it's often not sort of super obvious to think of it that way, but just like we talk about UX on the consumer side of media, television UX, digital UX, and in fact we heard a lot about that earlier today in the discussions, advertising media itself has a user experience context. So I think there are two sides to every UX user experience. They are how well does the product work? And then they are about how pleasant or interesting or engaging is it to use. And this sort of emerged from quite a few of these conversations. TV, to the marketers I spoke to, presents as a kind of black box. Now, to remind ourselves about what a black box is, it's a device processor system whose inputs and outputs are understood to work, but whose internal workings are a mystery, right? So scientific instruments are often black boxes and so on. TV looks to marketers like this. It works, as follows. Basically, it has inputs, planning, budgets, and it has outputs, posting reports, often months after the campaign has gone off the air. For marketers, TV is incredibly low touch, and it doesn't really provide information or feedback frequently enough to hold their attention. As a result, they feel uninvolved with their television campaigns. They feel that they're lacking a kind of agency over their TV campaigns. And of course, there's some real contrast here with how they feel about digital media. So I think just the conclusion from the black box piece here is that I'm not sure it's fair to say that TV doesn't have a user experience. I know that there are many people in this room who are working very hard on this, but I think in a way, in comparison to what the digital side, the sort of digital platform side has offered for, going on 2 decades now, it has a user experience that's comparatively non-existent. And the black box piece, the fact that it works and the fact that you can kind of put money into it and an order into it and you get a result out at the end is trusted, but it's not necessarily worthy of holding their attention on an ongoing basis. So, contrasting TV's black box with digital advertising, they talked about how digital advertising works really hard to articulate its value, not just during the sales stage, but on an ongoing basis all the time. So, there's this interactive planning and pricing model, for example, the programmatic offerings. There's ongoing reporting daily or, near real time, whatever you want to call it. There's the implied correlation of user response with impact achieved, something that for, going on 2 decades, the digital advertising industry it came out of the gate saying this, and in a way, this has never gone away, even though it's been, disproved a number of times, but it's still what marketers believe. It has these A/B capabilities to understand competitive performance of creative and so on. So all of these aspects made them feel involved with their digital advertising campaigns. So at the tooling level, digital advertising speaks to some broader cultural changes, right? These are all things that we can recognize, like the quantified self, all these like fitness trackers and sleep trackers and the personal productivity tools. You know, you can go on the Apple Store and there are, I don't know, like 30 different to-do list apps and all of this kind of stuff. In the world of business, in the world of business, there's, you know, analytics and big data, and so there's the general transformation that's been going on for a number of years now to, you know, evidence-based business. And of course, purchasing decisions are increasingly made based on user experience, not just on performance. Think of, you know, what made you decide to buy an iPhone or an Android phone. They are functionally the same, they do the same thing, and yet you had a preference. So the question is why? So digital advertising's UX, I think my marketers told me, worked really great at holding their attention. So, you know, I suspect, and it was also around this time last year, in the summer of last year, when I did the field work for this, that, you know, some of these inconsistencies, shall we say, of the digital advertising industry's numbers started to show up. You all remember these various things positioned either as sort of scandals or surprises, or anyway, everyone was aware of this in my panel, and they sort of talked about it. And what becomes clear, though, is that they didn't care. You know, I said to them, it was topical at the time, so I said, do you care that, you know, there was some kind of scandal in relation to Facebook's numbers? And they said, you know, not really. I think we have to take it all with a pinch of salt, and, you know, TV's numbers, well, it's also the industry producing its own numbers, right? This was kind of it came out verbatim with one or two of them, and it was implied by everyone else. So based on that, what I think is happening here is that, you know, digital advertising's user experience as a product produces these daily numbers, and what they represent is a kind of signal. It's a signal that says every day, every minute of every day, if you want, that it's working, it's working, it's working. And TV, in the current moment, does not produce a daily signal, right? I had marketers, I had two of the women, this was interesting as a sort of an aside, say to me that it was really hard in the Canadian context today to find out when exactly your commercial is actually going to air, right? So I'm sure this is not unfamiliar. And so they had set up a kind of informal commercial sighting network that consisted of all of their friends, and they would text each other to let each other know, sort of marketing friends, when they saw each other's commercial on air, just to kind of, you know, I don't know, get a sense what's going on, or sort of be excited about it, or whatever the case is. It's an aside, but it's also interesting, right? That people have kind of strung up these alternative mechanisms to try and be on top of something that they would clearly like to be on top of far more frequently than is currently afforded them. Several of them told us that, and this is a direct quote, dollar for dollar I get the same impact from television and digital. That's what they believe. I'm not saying if it's right or wrong. And yet overwhelmingly, they only spoke about their experience with digital media planning, buying, and execution, and reporting. So the platforms on the digital side seem to be fulfilling a very important purpose, which has nothing directly to do with whether the digital advertising product is working as a product, but has everything to do with getting and retaining marketers' attention. So it makes marketers feel smart, accomplished, and in control. If I have a daily number that I can report on, that's a good thing. That makes me look good. Let's talk for a minute about attention economics, because I think this is really an important kind of conclusion to draw from some of these insights. So attention, as we all know, being in the marketing industry, is a scarce resource, and it's directed according to certain economic principles. Share of attention is not the same as share of overall message volume. You all understand that attention can be influenced, because this is the industry that does that. And then typical techniques to capture attention include, you can look this up on Wikipedia, adding value to something or personalizing it. So I'm interested then, based on my corpus of insights from how these marketers spoke about the digital marketing industry, to go back and look at how does the digital advertising industry articulate its value, and how does it grab and hold people's attention. So we've already talked about how it does that through the platform-based reporting mechanisms, right? Information is kind of popping up all the time, and that's holding their attention. But it's also reasonable to say that the digital marketing industry has done a lot of very good work in how it articulates itself through its kind of sales approach. So when I said to them, you know, they all started laughing and they said, oh yes, Google and Facebook are in here every other week. I said, okay, well, what are they coming in for? And the answer was always, well, they're coming in for some kind of training. So what was on offer was effectively, I'll show you a new evolution of the platform, or I'll show you a case study, or I'll sit and work with you to make you a better digital marketer. So unlike a sales call, which is where you're being asked to spend money on something that doesn't really offer any value in return, what Google and Facebook are able to do is to go in and offer value which most marketers would probably be stupid to say no to, because it's also value that goes to their career advancement. It's value that, you know, it gives you knowledge in exchange for listening to Google or Facebook for a while. And that knowledge is obviously desirable. So that's the one piece that was really interesting. You know, they understood in the end when we dug down that these were really sales calls, but one of them, who had a larger team of people who worked for him, said to me, it's hard for me to say no when they come in and say and offer training, because I want to be seen as developing my team, so I'm going to say yes to the Google training event. So that's how they add value. And then we have, you know, vertically specific events, which is maybe the personalization piece of grabbing attention. And this was highly commented on. People were saying, you know, in contrast to how TV tends to articulate itself, Google and Facebook were quite good at articulating their business value by vertical. The automotive marketers in my sample spoke very highly of a Google automotive event that is put on, I believe, annually in Canada. One of them kind of said it's basically the only thing I'm going to anymore. So these things have become significant and meaningful in their worlds. And it's something where the general feedback seemed to be that TV, at least in their context, never had any vertical case studies for them. So that's clearly a takeaway for broadcast marketers supporting sales teams. You know, I mean, so these quotes here, which I'm sure you've read by now, so I'm not going to read them out to you, but they're representative. I mean, these are thoughtful people, but they will also take certain of these approaches at face value because they feel that it really enhances what they have to offer. Some of them do feel a little skeptical about some of this stuff, right? So it's amazing the results that Google shares with us, said one of them. Cynicism aside, they have a very deep and thorough Canadian-based research tool. They have seminars they want to do. They encourage us to occasionally test new things, and they're looking for partners to do that. So there's something in it for us if we agree to be a test partner. Another one said, I think there's the sense that winning with Google and Facebook is more forward-looking and more creative and exciting. So here's actually, in a way, the crux of it, to see interpretation delivered to me as part of what they're saying. And I would also say that I personally believe that's sort of a misnomer. Frankly, if I had to sit through one more Facebook presentation where they tell me they've changed their advertising algorithm, I'm going to scream, because every time it's always in their favor versus my favor. So they're not uncritical, but it's also really hard to say no, because it holds their attention through these mechanisms that I've talked about today. So in conclusion then, you know, everyone believes that TV works well, so those quantitative studies are not bad investments. At the register of knowledge, marketers throughout understand that TV works great and that it would be foolish to leave TV. But there is a difference between what they know and how they feel about things. Share of the attention economy is won by addressing this kind of non-rational realm, right? Emotion, desire, how I want to be seen by my colleagues and by extension by the agency roundtable. And I would say that digital campaigns offer this apparently self-evident proof that they are working. Readily available numbers, platform answers to address marketers' biggest concerns. That's very attractive to them, and it holds their attention. And then this idea of offering training rather than sales approaches, that offers value to the marketer personally, and therefore it's very difficult to say no to. I would say that broadcasters should focus on the user experience to, in a way, see if it's possible to make it as similar as possible to digital. Whatever that means in real terms, but maybe it's about, stepping up the frequency of reporting, all of these types of things, which are currently things that are getting lost between, the agency and the broadcaster and so on. No one's expecting it anymore, which is a little bit sad. And the share of attention through marketing training or direct relationships with advertisers would be an important thing. Brands, I think, should focus on not getting too distracted by shiny objects. Being aware of why things seem attractive might help them inflect their own and their team's behaviors in this regard. And they probably should focus on acting on what they know to be working. So that's it for me. Thank you.
That's marvelous stuff. We can raise the lights here. We're more than happy to take a couple of questions for Carsten if we've got them. So have them ready. A couple of things I struggle to believe that they're not excited about broadcast ad execution and planning. I mean, what's all that about? What is there not to be excited about? And also, it almost comes down to a feeling that they have towards them. So, how do media owners, let's just take Canada for example. There's 4 major media owners. How do they get that share of attention to get in their offices? They're not even picking up the phone for them, are they?
Yeah, I think that's challenging. I think there's a lot of probably groundwork that can be done, and I think that many of the major Canadian broadcasters are beginning to undertake, which is related to kind of rethinking the marketing support for their sales functions. Yeah. So in other words, articulating vertical value, making it specific to what these marketers appear to be asking for. I also think that maybe there's, there is value ultimately. Clearly, there's value in exploring ways to re-involve marketers with their television campaigns. So I don't know that I have exact answers on how that should work. I think a big unanswered piece for me is I've sort of surrounded the agencies in this work. I did not speak to agencies. It wasn't part of the study, but it would be really interesting to look at. I think the hard things to think about and address for Canadian broadcasters, and by extension maybe all broadcasters, is economics and role of agencies, and what role they play or no longer play in some of these contexts. But producing something that tells me that my TV campaign is working when it is actually on the air would probably be a fantastic first step. Yeah,
that's difficult to achieve. Do you think broadcasters are cool enough to get these sort of these meetings? Do you think that's a problem?
It's really hard to say. They had, I suppose in many ways, my sample had some feedback on that. But you know what? I don't know that that's the problem. No, I think it is maybe, but it's a practical factor. It's the sort of thing that modern organizations overcome all the time. These kinds of challenges.
But it's their ability to work in the verticals, which is very hard because they're global. It's very hard for domestic media owners to compete on that level. And in fact, when we talked about this yesterday, a few of you may have seen this, that Joe Markeshi and a few others believes that TV shouldn't fight on that basis. They shouldn't fight on an outcomes basis. They shouldn't fight Google, on their turf, because it's a battle they're not going to win. Do you have a comment on that?
I suspect, I mean, if I just go on the results from this study, I suspect it is necessary to engage with that fight somehow. And I simply think, again, because, you know, it doesn't really go to the intrinsics of whether or not the one media offering works better for a certain context than the other. It goes to, right, what my research really suggests is that it goes to attention as much as it goes to whether or not it's working. So if your audience, as it were, your purchasers are distracted by the competition, that cannot be good news for you, regardless of how great your product is. So I do think that we need to probably try and figure those things out.
Okay, I've been a bit selfish here. Do we have a question here for Carsten from the audience? We've got time for one quick question. We're going to move on to the panel. No? Okay, well, Carsten's going to be here for the rest of the event. We've got Catherine, who's sitting in halfway up there. She's happy to talk to you about how she commissioned this too. Let's give Carsten a massive round of applause coming over here and delivering that.